Hi everyone and welcome back to the garden. It feels like a while since I've done a video. I know it's not really, but for those of you who don't follow me on Facebook or Instagram, we actually got married last Sunday, the 30th of May. We had an amazing day, and I must say a massive thanks to everyone on Facebook, on Instagram, who wished us congratulations and all the best. It really is appreciated. We were so lucky with the weather, and to actually have a bit of sun after all that rain and cold we've actually had, it was absolutely amazing. And this past week we went to Centre Parks for a few days, not far, but again we were so lucky with the weather, had so much sun, so much warmth, it really was fantastic. And I must say massive thanks to Alice's dad for coming while we were away and watering the garden on Wednesday. The plants have responded really well, maybe to the watering but also the heat, and it's great to see everything actually finally starting to grow. But today, this might seem a bit random, but I'm actually planted up a shady area of the garden. So I thought it might help you just to see the sort of plants that I'm putting in, the sort of colour combos I'm going for. And really, it's a sort of north-facing area. I've got quite a tall fence separating it from the south. So I suppose technically it's north-facing. It's an area that won't see much in the way of direct sun. So hopefully there's a few plant ideas here. If you've got a shady garden or even just an area under some trees that you're looking to plant up. The area in question is definitely going to have a tropical sort of jungle vibe, but also the plants are mostly hardy and they're mostly plants that are evergreen that will stay looking good through winter. So it's not just about that colour in the summer months, that's pretty easy to get with such a wide range of plants, but it's about plants that keep that colour rolling through the winter while still not looking too boring in summer. So hopefully you get some ideas from the choices. Like I said, a lot of them are hardy plants, they're easy to look after and they don't need any particularly special care. So once I've done that, I then want to move on and show you how much the Gunnera Manicata has grown while I've been away. The leaves are absolutely massive now, so I just wanted to give you a quick look at that before I do my tour video in a few weeks' time. So this is the area in question behind me, and before I drop the camera down I'll just show you, we've got the tall fence there, there's the ivy overhanging, and south is pretty much that way. So this area is pretty much north facing, and I'll just drop the camera down now. And there you can see I've got a rough layout in a minute. What I tend to do is put a lot of the pots in the position where they're going to go. It gives you a few sort of chances to make your mind up as to whether the plants are staying there or whether you're going to rejuggle it, and it's worth doing before you actually put anything into the ground. So what I'll probably do, I'll take the camera off a tripod and show you a quick look around what I've already got in the ground and in the wall, and then I'll go through each plant in turn and show you why they're really good plants for a tropical shade garden. That's better, you can actually see it now. So, look in the middle, we've got the waggy palm, which is Trachycarpus wagnerianus, and you definitely want to call them waggy palm, it's certainly a better name. But if you saw on my Instagram, that's one I actually put in with Max just a few weeks ago, and that's going to be the centrepiece of this border. And the theory is that that'll grow nice and tall, and it'll keep going up, so a lot of these plants will form a sort of mat of colour around it. And this is a stone wall that I chucked together a few weeks ago. I say chucked together, it didn't take long, but it is relatively sturdy, it doesn't move at all. And what you might notice in the cracks and crevices, I put a Tradescentia there, and I put a few spider plants. So we'll see how well they go. I've just put in a bit of, we'll say, some moss off the lawn, and I'll try to give them water most days, but we'll see how well they take, and if they give the wall that little bit of exotic greenery. So, looking around, first thing that might surprise you is how many plants are in here, especially when I usually talk about how you need to leave space for everything, but the clue really here is that a lot of these plants don't grow too big. Now, an exception to that would be the Fatzias. These are the plants that I generally recommend as a nice sort of budget tropical starter plant. They're really tough, really hardy, and I've got two at the back there. So in theory, one of these by itself could be enough in a few years' time to actually fill up this whole area, but they are quite controllable. So this one's got lots of stems, and you can prune those back, but my main thought was, they give a nice sort of backdrop, a nice leafy backdrop to this sort of fence here, and they, like I say, they can be controlled, but they're also an evergreen, and they give some height to it in the time it takes this waggy to actually establish itself. So those are going at the back there, and then dotted around them, pretty much every other plant stays quite small. The more ground cover and more sort of supporting colourful plants. So I'll just have a quick look at those in turn now. I'm not saying this design is something that you should copy off yourself plant for plant, but hopefully the general sort of theme and plants that I use inspire you in your garden. So what I tend to do, you might notice there's a few multiples of the same plants, and I tend to dot them around. So I don't exactly create a mirrored or symmetrical border, but it's helpful to have that bit of repetition, and it sort of ties the garden together. So even if you're not looking at it from a design point of view, just having those repeated plants helps create a bit more of a cohesive design, and you start to see the same sort of repeated colours and forms throughout it. It just makes the whole garden sort of come together more. But that being said, there is quite a lot of variety in the border, and I just want to show you a few of those plants. First off, we're looking at Heucheras, which are one of my absolute favourite plants. Firstly, I should clarify, when I say favourite plant, probably not my all-out favourite, and they're never going to be a showstopper like a tree fern or a banana plant, but they're definitely a plant I wouldn't be without in the garden, and they're so helpful for bringing colour to all those shady, tricky areas. But when I first look at a border like this, the first thing I look at is height of the plants. So you'll see the Fatsia japonicas at the back, they're the taller plants and they're going to grow up against that fence. But generally speaking, every other plant in that border isn't going to get much taller than around 30 centimetres, maybe tall and then about 30 centimetres wide again. So it's quite easy to predict how they're going to mesh together and the space they're going to take up. So once I've looked at overall height, I then look at colour. And I'm not saying you need to research every single plant you buy. I would recommend researching something that's maybe a little bit more unusual or a plant you don't know how to look after. But I did buy some of these as impulse purchases. Obviously I knew roughly what I was looking for. But when it comes to Heucheras and ferns and everything like that, there's so many amazing varieties. I think you need to go for the ones that really grab you. And the reason why Heucheras are so amazing is just because of the variety of colours you can get them in. So looking here, you'll see that one is green spice. And there's quite a few like this that are green but with a little bit of a design to them. So these are, we'll say, at the more tasteful end of the spectrum, but you can get varieties like this. There's so many different ones you can get with different oranges and reds, and when you get the sun behind them, the leaves look absolutely amazing underneath. So really it's a case of choose a rough sort of colour scheme and there will be a Heuchera for it. And you need to get loads of them and pack them in. They're not expensive, and one thing I would say if you're buying them is I wouldn't probably buy plugs off eBay. They might be cheap, but you can get plants like this here for £5 each. So we live near Appleby and there's a nursery there, Lindham Nurseries, and they sell them £5.99 each, 2 for a tenner. And even at garden centres you'll probably pay around £5 to £8 for something this size for a relatively well established plant, and if you put that in the ground it will come up again next year. So unlike coleus, which are a very tender plant and won't survive outside, these you can create the same sort of coloured effects, but they will come up again year after year. So that's helpful that you're not creating another plant you need to overwinter or take cuttings from and all the faffing around like that. You can plant these in and know that they'll come back. And it's also helpful to plant these around more established plants or plants like that palm, the Trachyharpus. I don't want to disturb the roots every year by digging up and putting coleus and other bedding plants around it, whereas these can create a similar sort of effect, the same sort of colour spectrum without having to dig them up. So they're really useful in that regard. If you haven't grown Heucheras before, then they're quite an easygoing plant. A lot of them do prefer a bit of shade, but they're generally pretty easygoing as long as you don't let them completely dry out. And you can get them in different colours, ranging from real dark purples and some that are almost black, to right at the other end of the spectrum, lime greens and yellows. But here, I've generally gone for a theme of greens and sort of variations of green with a few splashes of purples and reds and those really bright warm colours. So I've chosen Heucheras to fit in with that scheme. And whilst they're mainly grown for the leaves, the foliage, they do actually send up flowers around this time, and the bees absolutely love them. So they're great for the pollinators, great in terms of low maintenance, and they're cheap as well. Now my next group of plants I'm going to look at are ferns like this. And they're especially helpful plants. I know a lot of you have come into tropical gardening without having a lot of years of actual gardening experience, and for that, ferns are an absolutely great filler plant. So if you don't know a lot about them, you can get so many different types, and if there's one plant that you can use to fill that awkward shady area that you don't have to worry around, that will fit in with the tropical theme and come back year after year, ferns are definitely that plant. And this is one of my absolute favourites. It's a Dryopteris, and its brilliance. That is one of my absolute favourites, purely because the new fronds, this one hasn't coiled up really well, but the fronds come out this beautiful sort of red burnished copper colour, and then they gradually fade to this green colour. And ferns, they're such an amazing plant because they don't need any looking after. If you just give them a good bit of watering, they're absolutely fine, and once they're settled in, a lot of them are actually suitable for quite dry shade as well. But what you might find is, even the sort of evergreen ones, after winter they can look a bit brown, they're a little bit past the best, but usually within a few weeks all those new fronds come out, even bigger than last year's, and they look absolutely fantastic. So obviously they're great with the tree ferns, with Gunneras, pretty much any kind of tropical plant works well with a few ferns around it. I wouldn't probably have them if I had really sandy soil, but in any sort of normal garden soil, if you've got a bit of shade or even sort of semi-partial shade, ferns should be absolutely fine. And there's so much variety too. So you get ones like this, obviously this Heucheras, which is quite a delicate plant that will sort of work well with other greens and oranges and reds, purples, anything like that. And you also get quite a lot of other varieties. You get some varieties like this Polypodium, which are obviously a lot lighter lime green in colour and again quite a delicate plant. And you can actually see on some of the mature fronds all the spores that will form the plants in future, so it'd be nice if some of those actually started self-seeding. And you can also get plants like this, Asplenium, where the leaves are slightly more chunky looking, definitely a lot more solid, but again they all work really well with the Fatzias, with these beautiful glossy leaves. If you go to any garden centre, chances are they've got a fern section, so I don't want to give you too many different specific varieties, but chances are if you go there thinking what might work with my tropical or exotic planting scheme, I'm sure you'll find a good few. So I use some around the base of tree ferns where they can cope with the shade. They also appreciate the same moist conditions that the tree fern does. And also the really tough plants, they can cope well with their root competition because they're used to growing in forest or woodland environments. And here in front of the brick shed, just to show you a bit of the variety you can get hold of. Got some which are more sort of structural upright plants, and others like this Terrace umbrosa, which has got these really delicate sort of leaves. There really is just so many different sorts you can get. Some are evergreen. Again, there's a Heucheras brilliance. And others just appear like there, the ostrich fern that's just popped up. And one benefit of using ferns is they can be used really well to actually soften hard landscaping. So here next to the boulder, it's not a perfect example, but you'll see next to this one here, which again is another Heucheras brilliance. You can see there's lovely sort of brown fronds, but they work so well. They're great on edges. So anything where there's an edge, if a fern is over it, it just instantly gives that sort of jungly vibe. So from ferns then to another plant that appreciates moist shady areas that I've also got dotted throughout the garden, and that's hostas. So this one here is a small banana bay, and I chose it because it's got that little bit of yellow variegation just to give it that flash of bright colour. And I think anywhere you've got shade, if you can bring a bit of yellow or even white variegation to it, it just gives you that little bit of light there, it brightens up the area and it really helps draw your eye in. Now this one is quite a small hosta, and again if you're not familiar with them as a plant, there's so many different types available. So most of the ones that I grow are the bigger varieties. Around my Gunneras I've got an Empress Woo, which is pretty much the biggest hosta you can get, and then I've also got Southern Substance either side that. Again, a really big hosta. But those, they need plenty of space, and obviously giving them plenty of space means that when they die down in winter, they do tend to die down around September, October time. You don't want a big empty space, somewhere you're going to be looking at all year. So for me, a little hosta like this is absolutely perfect for giving that splash of colour, but without dominating the whole of this area. And also, when it dies down over winter, the other ferns around it, the evergreen plants, will soon sort of expand to take up that sort of boringness. So this one, like I said, it's called Banana Bay, but there's so many miniature hostas, there's so many medium ones. Again, if you just go to a local garden centre near you and you look at your hostas in terms of what will fit in my tropical garden scheme, there's going to be so many different ones. If you watched my last video on Persicaria, you might recognise this guy hanging out at the back. This is Persicaria Purple Fantasy, and it's a fantastic gap filling plant. It copes well with shade, and it can also take a bit of sun as well. And for me, I was choosing between this one or the Red Dragon, but in the end, this plant with its more sort of green leaves, I think it's going to go really well with those ferns. And whilst it's not evergreen, it's very quick to grow back in spring. And although the frost cuts it back to the ground, it will come back again strongly. They're a very, very tough plant. And it can potentially spread a bit, and it can also get taller than 30 centimetres. But the good news is it's very easy to control. So if the clump starts to spread a bit too much, you can just take a trowel to it and just hack a section away and plant it somewhere else in the garden, which is exactly what I've done with this bit here. So the clump wasn't getting too big, but I needed a section of it, and I don't want to spend any more money on plants in this area. So I just dug a section up and I'll put it in the ground here, and it will just romp away. It hardly needs any time to settle in. And the best thing is, when it starts to get too tall, you can just chop it back. It doesn't really matter, you don't have to be too scientific about chopping a certain amount off the stems. What I tend to do is just cut them somewhere between two leaves, and then you can use that section as a cutting, and the plant itself, within a couple of weeks, it'll be sprouting back again and be more bushy and fitting better with the overall planting scheme. So they're really fantastic plants, and I've gone for the back of the border for this one, so we can grow up against that wall and hopefully make it look a bit more natural. Now the last plant you might have noticed is this, which is actually a dead nettle, and like yourselves, I'm very susceptible to impulse buys, again if they fit in with the general theme of what I'm looking for. I was going to use another Persicaria at the front of the border because I generally like plants that spill over a bit at the front. I think anywhere where you've got jungly tropical planting, you sort of need to push over those boundaries and over borders a little bit just to really give it that jungle vibe. So like I said, I was going to use a Persicaria, but we actually went on a day out to Clumber Park on the way back from Centre Parks, and I saw this. It wasn't massively expensive, and again it's another shade lover. I like the variegation for leaves. It gives a slightly different plant to that far corner, but also the flowers are purple, so they do fit in with the Heucheras and try to give that sort of general sort of purple and hot red sort of scheme. So that is one thing I would say, if you're putting a border together, definitely, like I've done, place the pots out before you put them into the ground, and that way you actually consider how big each plant's going to get, and you can choose a layout that works for you. I appreciate you don't all buy the plants in one go before you plant a border, and generally speaking I don't either. I've just done it really for this video. I've tried to sort of save up my planting for a few weeks, but it's worth spotting each one out. And if the border still doesn't look right, it can be actually worth looking at the overall colour scheme, and it could be you've got too many different colours going on. So what I tend to do if the border looks a little bit too complicated or visually just doesn't work quite well, there's probably a lot of theory behind it, but sometimes you just have to go with your gut instinct. But one thing you can do if it just looks a little bit too messy is just strip it back to green. So just go for the green plants first, and you might find it looks more harmonious then, and at that point you can slowly start to introduce colours. So there's a few people, I know Jack Wellington, who's on Gardener's World recently, he's got an amazing garden, and I followed him on Instagram for quite a while, and one of the things that really struck me about his garden is he's so restrained with his colour palette, and it just helps the whole garden just gel, and it just looks really classy and stylish. For me, there's so many different plants that I enjoy growing. I wouldn't even claim to have a certain sort of colour theme, but what I tend to do is work off those greens first, have as many different greens in the garden as I can, and for me it's sort of worked out that it's been more purples and orangey red colours. I think they really help fit in with that tropical theme. So before I show you the Gunnera, just a quick overview then of the space. So like I said, you've got the waggy there in the middle, and as you can see I've sort of dotted the colours around. So the Fattias are spread across there with the Heucheras fern in the middle. As the Fattias grow up nice and tall, that fern will thrive there in the shade. And again, I've used the Heucheras here to help break up the sort of rough sort of stone line. So I'm trying to use plants that are a bit taller at the back and then gradually move to smaller plants, whilst having some, like the dead nettle there, that just hang over. And all this will be grassed eventually. I might not keep this border as it is, but the stone's there for now. So these plants work really well with this stone, but equally, if we go for a more sort of modern border to it, I think they'll work really well with that. And as you can see, while each individual plant maybe isn't a star in itself, I think they all work really well together. And even for a shady border, there's no excuse not to have so many different colours and such a variety of plants. But anyway, on from these to a plant that's a lot bigger and definitely wouldn't fit in this border, the Gunnera Manicata. So as you can see, the Gunnera Manicata have got absolutely massive. Look at the size of these leaves, and I think really those couple of weeks of rain we had really gave them the boost that they need. And these, they're still very young plants, so if you didn't see it in a previous video, I actually got one offset from a very mature established plant, which was this one in the middle here. I got that around 3 years ago, so again it's still only a baby, and from that one I took off 2 divisions when I knew we were moving house last year, so that was last spring, and those now, the leaves are nearly as big as this one, so they're really fast growing. And I know there's a lot of uncertainty on Facebook about which Manicata is which. Basically, a lot of the Gunneras in the UK, they're sold and labelled up as Manicata, but they're actually Gunnera Tinctoria, which is potentially invasive and not as big a plant. So really, you want the Manicata if you've got the space for it. Tinctoria is still a great plant, and I will do a video looking at care of both Tinctoria and Manicata. But the reality is, Tinctoria gets big, the leaves can get to 1 metre across, so it still gets to be a pretty big plant, but Manicata is the real deal. And I'm nearly 6'4", but when I went down to Cornwall and saw them in Treba and Helligan, there's some amazing gardens down there, and they absolutely towered over me. So the actual stalks can get thicker than your wrist and around 8 foot tall, and the leaves themselves can be a further 8 foot wide leaf on top of that. They're absolutely colossal things. They're huge plants, and I definitely wouldn't be without them in my garden. But there's a couple of differences between Manicata and Tinctoria that you can use to help you. Obviously, it's very tricky when they're small plants, and like I said, I will look at it in more detail, but if you get a chance to see a mature one, or you're wanting to buy a bigger plant, then one of the easiest ways to tell him is that Manicata leaves, they're generally flatter, and they've got white veins in them, whereas Tinctoria tend to be a little bit redder, and the leaves have a more crinkled appearance. The easiest way to tell them apart, if you're looking at a really big specimen, is just the size of it. So even though these were in pots last year and not watered maybe as much as they should have been, just with the move and everything, it went a bit crazy, they still put out some absolutely massive leaves. So even in a pot that's maybe that big, you can still get leaves even a metre wide. And the other way, that's probably the easiest way to tell them apart when they do get to a decent size, is the flower. It looks dramatically different between both plants. So I'll just show you that now. So looking into the middle plant then, this is a Gunnera Manicata flower, and they're such crazy looking prehistoric things. But what you will notice is that the flowers are quite loose, they're quite open, and there's a lot of space in between the individual, I suppose there's a scientific word for it, but we'll say branches or bracts. Whereas a Tinctoria flower looks almost like that young sort of Manicata flower there. It looks more like a toilet brush, and the individual sort of pieces aren't quite as long, they're a lot more packed in, and the whole flower is a lot more compact. So if you see a flower like this, the Manicata is what you're looking at. And as you can see here, this is a new leaf waiting to open, and this leaf will be hopefully just as big, or maybe even bigger than this massive leaf there. And that one, if you look closer, you'll see what I mean about the veins. So they are really sort of light coloured white veins, whereas the Tinctoria, generally, they look a lot redder. And I just think they're such amazing plants. Here, I've got it mixed with their Hosta Empress Wu, which is one of the larger hostas I'll talk about earlier, and they're right under the canopy of this amazing tree fern, which the fronds are coming out now and they're still not at the full length. It's just such an incredible plant. As always, thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. So what I'm going to be doing now is digging those plants into the ground, giving them a good sort of spreading of chicken manure pellets or bloodfish and bone around them, and then giving them all a good watering in, especially as we've got a warm week coming up. And likewise for the Gunnera, this week it'll be getting plenty of water and plenty of feed to really get those leaves growing. So thanks for watching, keep checking back soon. I've got more videos coming up, then hopefully the 3rd or 4th week of June I've got my next garden tour video. So I've got a few bits just to sort out before I can show you it, but I think it's going to look absolutely amazing, and hopefully you'll be as pleased with the garden progress as I am. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all soon.